Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I wanted to take some time to talk about the final boss of 11.2's new raid, Dimensius, and give some strategy thoughts and predictions on how I think the fight is going to go based on the PTR dungeon journal, because of course it was not available for testing during the Manaforge Omega raid testing schedule. I will be putting out a full edited guide shortly after the patch launches once my guild has actually killed the boss on heroic difficulty, but I know that that does take a few days, and a lot of you guys do pull that boss on normal or heroic in the meantime. And I want to give you guys some ideas of how I'm initially thinking about this boss, just so maybe you have an easier time tackling the boss before that guide actually comes out. And I just really do want to emphasize here that this is based entirely on the dungeon journal. It could be totally wrong, right? I could be off base on how the mechanics actually function. We're obviously missing details in general on some of these abilities in the dungeon journal, and it also could be changed, right? We're a couple weeks out from the patch itself, so there is time for them to still change these abilities as well. So just keep all that in mind. And again, make sure you do subscribe to the channel so you get notified when that full guide does come out a few weeks from now. Otherwise, let's get started with phase 1 out of this 3-phase encounter. So of course this is going to be a giant boss, and being a giant boss, if you ever touch him you instantly die. In terms of how this platform actually works, we have an idea as well thanks to raidplan.io here. I can make that a little bigger for you guys. See that? So basically, this is what the P1 phase is assumed to look like. So you get this giant pit here, which is most likely Dimensius, and then you have this kind of platform here to work with. Now, I think people have data mined the actual size of Dimensius. I'm not really sure how to put it in perspective, but my guess is this platform is probably very large given the scale of Dimensius that we've heard of. So, rule number 1, never actually touch Dimensius. There's also some passive damage, which continues throughout all the boss phase of this fight. You're just taking that constantly, so there's something for healers to actually do. The main mechanic of this phase is called Devour. So this happens every 100 energy. It does seem, according to the journal, that the boss is going to start with some energy, so the first Devour is going to happen quite quickly and basically deals heavy damage over 5 seconds. And then after 5 seconds, if you don't have enough of this buff called collective gravity, you just die. He pulls you into the himself, and you get you trigger this oblivion thing. So how this actually works is through the tank mechanic in Massive Smash. So this is a 20-yard AoE hit around the tank. As you can see, this is going to be wanting to play your tank pretty far away because you don't want to cleave that hit. And this is going to cause some of these living mass mobs to spawn. The big thing is, we don't know much about this. So it says it scatters living mass. It doesn't specify a number, right? Does it spawn 1 mass? Does it spawn 2, 3, 4? Who really knows? How many of these hits even happen before the Devour is cast? Again, not something we know. Again, based on the dungeon journal over here, it's assumed that less happen during the before the first Devour, and then you get this static number between every other Devour because of the energy gain differences. But we don't know the exact number of casts, so we don't know the exact number of living mass adds we have. And the whole bit with them is, outside of dealing random damage, they will drop excess mass on death. The way this reads to me, living mass decays into excess mass, makes it seem like each add will give you 1 excess mass that you can pick up. That could be wrong. Maybe this splits into multiple. Again, not totally sure, but my assumption is maybe each smash spawns 2 living mass. Each living mass drops 1 excess mass. That's my best guess based on this, but it could be any combination of things, right? And the whole idea is that when you have 2 players that have excess mass and they get within 3 yards of each other, they make this 6-yard collective gravity field, and this is what gives you stacks of collective gravity to prevent yourself from being sucked in by that Devour cast, which happens at full energy. And you actually get 1 stack of collective gravity for each player inside this zone with excess mass. So the 2 people just forming the zone in general will give everyone inside 2 stacks of collective gravity. Now, going back to the actual Devour cast itself here, it's going to consume all excess mass and living mass after the cast is done as well. So you're going to start fresh every time you cast Devour. It also increases his hunger, which means that the stacks of collective gravity required to not be murdered by this cast is increasing. So assuming it starts at 2 because that's like the default number to even form a collective gravity well. And it goes up by maybe 1, maybe 2 each time. Again, not totally sure. Let's just assume it goes up by 1 each time. You're going to need to then kill at least 3 of these living mass ads, right? So you're going to be needing to kill more of these ads and stack into this collective gravity zone each time, until eventually maybe there is a devour cast where you don't have enough collective gravity to survive the hit, and that would be the P1 Enrage. In terms of the actual boss health in this phase, based on the dungeon journal, again, it seems like you have to deplete his health entirely. So he's going to start at some health number. Maybe it's 100%, maybe it's lower than 100%. That would kind of be my guess, is that he doesn't start at 100% health because he's not fully formed yet, but who knows? But you have to bring him to 0% health regardless of where his starting health is. So it could be a situation where he's just a regular old boss. You kill him from 100 to 0 in this phase. It could also be a situation where execute is randomly really, really good because the boss just starts at like 40% health or 20% health or something like that, right? Who knows? But it does look like you're gonna have to deplete his health fully, at least based on the wording of the journal. Now, the other thing to keep in mind of when it comes to tanks and staying away from them outside of the actual massive smash hit, there's also this passive the boss has just at all times, which makes his melee attacks deal bonus shadow damage and then also do a 15-yard splash, which knocks back any additional players nearby and does that shadow damage to them. So you need to make sure that your active tank is just playing off in his own little world, and that when you taunt swap, that tank is also playing off in his own little world. So something to keep in mind. Taunt swap is, of course, that massive smash cast that I was talking about earlier that spawns the ads and just puts a fizz damage amp on you. So you do want to taunt relatively quickly because, of course, I'm kind of assuming this boss's melees are going to absolutely truck, if I had to guess. The other important mechanic of this phase is called Shattered Space. So basically, he slams his hands down. They do lethal 10-yard AoEs, which you need to avoid. It also deals some passive AoE damage, which you can't avoid. And then it creates these spheres of antimatter, as well as just a bunch of like fragments that you need to dodge. The antimatter orbs are pretty interesting. So there's going to be 2 of them up, right? And you basically have 10 seconds from them spawning before they explode for this lethal hit of raid damage. But these will tick every 0.5 seconds of those 10 seconds to anyone within 10 yards after that initial impact, right? Because the initial impact is lethal. But you're going to have to send people in here basically to soak away some of the raid hit every 0.5 seconds. Now, the math on this and how it works is that exactly 3 players, if they're in there for like the entire duration of the 10-second soak, are going to be able to basically fully deplete this over the course of those 10 seconds. Now that cuts it pretty close. They have to be in there for the whole 10 seconds, taking this pretty heavy dot damage. So if I had to guess, you'd probably want 4 to 5 players in each of these antimatter soaks, right? So you're gonna have to split your group potentially into 2. Maybe you just have 2 hit squads that move away from the main raid stack towards these 2 antimatter spheres. But either way, my guess is you'd want to assign 4 to 5 people to each antimatter in order to do that. There's no debuff, so it seems like the same 4 to 5 people can always go to like the left hand, and the same 4 to 5 people can always go to the right hand and do those soaks. Again, you can't use your tank because they have to be 15 yards away from everyone else. Maybe the off tank who's not currently on the boss could do it, but your actual tank cannot. So you have to have other people doing this soaking here. And the other thing we don't know is if the hand spots are static. So like, again, if we look at this boss room, like, is he always throwing his right hand here and his left hand here? Is he facing them, or does he drop them based on the direction he's facing? So like if the one tank is here, does he drop one hand here and one hand here? We don't know exactly. My best guess would be probably static positions, but again, we don't 100% know how that's going to function, so you're going to have to adjust on the fly. The thing that makes this a bit more annoying is this dark matter mechanic, specifically on heroic difficulty, because on normal, these are just 4-yard circles that spawn under players, so you just avoid them. On heroic and mythic, it actually leaves behind these slow puddles. So if you have these static hand positions, for example, you don't want to have these puddles spawn there, so you need to make sure that you are moving away towards the outer edges or grouping up as a raid to actually stack these puddles away from where you need to be later on in the phase. So positioning becomes quite important. Outside of this, the excess mass players, so the people that pick up the debuffs from the living mass mobs, are going to have an extra job here in reverse gravity. So this is a 6-yard AoE hit around random players, and it knocks them airborne. So my guess is they just kind of float up into the air, and they're just kind of static in the air there. And basically, if you just leave them up there and they get targeted by reverse gravity again, they instantly die. They get ejected into Dimensius, and they get consumed or oblivion, whatever it is, and they just die. So how to actually deal with this is a person with the excess mass debuff can stand under them, and that, I assume, slowly drags them back onto the ground. So again, make sure you are assigning specific people that you trust to do mechanics to pick up these the excess mass from these living mass, because they'll be in charge of making sure the entire raid doesn't die by touching for a collective gravity well, but also in charge of running around and pulling reverse gravity people back down to the ground. So mobile range, BM hunter job, baby, let's go. But really just anyone you trust to keep an eye out for airborne players, group up at the right time, etc., to actually make sure you don't die to those mechanics. Now, that is it for phase 1. Like I said, it goes likely until the boss goes to 0 health or something down there. Could be wrong, but it's what it seems like by the dungeon journal. And then when that happens, we actually all get sucked into the heart, the dark heart. And there's a intermission phase here where we are dragon riding. Woo! Woo! Dragon riding phase. So basically the whole bit of this phase is you need to maintain the soaring Reshi buff. Think of it kind of like Dawnbreaker. If I had to give you an example, like as you're flying in the Rashanon phase to the Rashanon platform, you have this light buff, which you get by collecting the orbs. And if you lose that light buff, you die. Same thing here. If you lose your Soaring Reshi buff, you just die to endless darkness. So you need to make sure you're maintaining it by flying through these umbral gates. These also give you a burst of speed and restore vigor. So you need to make sure you're following this path, probably similar to like the Tindril rings, if I had to guess, but like voidy themed. While this is happening, I assume Dimensius is still around, because apparently if you touch him in this phase, you still die. So his body is still kind of floating around in this area. He's also throwing planets at you, shooting out these jets of radiation you need to avoid. And also, apparently, there's a bunch of black holes in this phase, which will spaghettify you. So basically, everything in this phase, if you get hit by it, one-shots you, which is kind of nice. Very, very interesting. But to your advantage, there are also these stars, these stellar cores. And if you fly into them, you'll be able to deal damage to a Void Lord when you land, which I assume is referring to the mobs in phase 2. So you'll probably want to pick up as many of these as possible, which will make your phase 2 significantly easier, all while dodging all this other stuff while still flying through these gates so you don't immediately die. And then that brings us to phase 2, the Dark Heart, where you are not fighting the boss, you are fighting the 2 devoured lords. And how this looks in the journal is it's actually 2 different platforms. And you can see there's this central thing in the middle here, which there's a platform on either side, as you can see here, Entropy and Conquest. And so the question here is, do you need to split your raid, or do you go to one platform as a raid, you do that platform, and then you have another flying phase going to a 3rd platform, and then you do that platform as a raid? That's the one I'm leaning towards. Not 100% sure, again, how it's going to work entirely, but it does seem that way because of how the tank mechanic works on these platforms. Basically, these are the 2 Void Lords, Artishion and Pargoth. Both have the same tank buster, which is a stacking dot that immediately kills you at 15 stacks. And this is, unless the boss just stops autoing for like 10 seconds at a time, I don't see a way to drop this debuff. Potentially, maybe he gets busy casting some other abilities and you have to kite the mini boss or something like that. But outside of that, there's no real way to actually drop this debuff unless you have like a melee DPS, taunt the boss and take it. So my assumption is that you do one platform and then you have another flying phase and you do another platform, but who actually knows? That would also give you the ability to have the stellar core. You collect some for the first guy, do a big hit of damage to him, and then fly up and collect to the second guy. The other question is, we're not exactly sure how many of these stellar cores are going to be in the area, right? How much health are we going to be able to take off of them? And that is important because you are timed when you are killing these guys, because they have this eclipse cast, which I think lasts 32 seconds in like the spell data. But we don't know when is this going to actually cast, because it could just be passively happening, and then as soon as you land, your timer starts. You have 32 seconds to kill this guy, because when he reaches 100 energy, his ritual completes and you're donezo. Does this start, later on, maybe like 20 seconds after you land? Do they start doing this at the same time on different platforms, right? Because that could also be important. And then it's just like this whole tank debuff is just, you can't get autoed successfully 15 times in the 32 seconds, otherwise you die, which, that could be a way for you to split this up, where you're not supposed to ever reach 15 stacks because you're supposed to kill the mob before that time, right? So that is a way for it to be split, but we don't really know how this is going to function, though. So there is a chance that you need to split and kill these guys at the same time, or near the same time, because of this cast triggering at the same time on both platforms. There's also a chance that maybe it only triggers on one at a time, and then you can go that way. Who knows? Kind of up in the air. So we'll have to wait and see. In terms of mechanics on these platforms, there's a couple from Dimensius himself. He's still throwing planets at you. This guy is huge. We're going to throw planets, so you need to dodge these, otherwise you get absolutely owned. He also has this channel damage, which is 4 seconds of taking damage and a pushback. And so, again, these platforms have edges off into space, so you definitely do not want to be pushed off the edge of these platforms, so watch out for those. In terms of the mini bosses themselves, they each have their own unique ability, and then they share their other abilities. Like I said, the tank buster is shared. The unique ability for Artosian is a frontal line attack that knocks players back. Unsure if this follows players, is on the tank, random target, whatever, so we'll have to wait and see, but you definitely are supposed to dodge it. If I had to guess, maybe the tank specifically can't dodge it, but I assume it's not a tank mechanic with the dot going out. And then on heroic, this also leaves behind puddles, so you may want to actually bait where this frontal is going so that you don't take up too much space. It makes it harder during that pushback as well. If you get pushed into these puddles, it can be quite dangerous. In terms of Pargos ability, it's Stardust Nova, which is a 10-yard AoE around the mob. So you just want to tank this guy again towards the edges, just to conserve space and drop this away from where your group is getting pushed back. In terms of the other ability they share, it's Conqueror's Cross, which spawns a bunch of mobs. On normal, this only spawns a Void Warden. On heroic, it spawns Void Warden, and Nullbinders. So you get a new ad type. These Nullbinders do picking shadow damage for 20 seconds. That also slows, so again, makes it more annoying to fight that pushback effect. And potentially you get multiple of them, because it does say this affects stacks. So I am curious if it's like, oh, the slow can get really, really terrible, or if it's only the dot affects that stack, or if you're even getting 2 at a time. I kind of assume it because it says this affects stacks, but not 100% sure. In terms of the Void Warden, it says they serve to secure his territory and restrict player movement. It also says some's a phalanx of them, so I wonder if there's like some sort of formation in terms of how they spawn, whether these guys are tankable, because that's another thing that could impact how many tanks they expect you to have on a platform, right? Because we're not really sure. It kind of says they just kind of knock back players near them. So I do kind of wonder if these are just guys that move in the set pattern, and you like need to kill one of them to like break a hole in the pattern. Like if they're in a ring around you, sealing in, doesn't really feel like a phalanx. So maybe they're in like some other formation sweeping across the platform or something like that. But you would only be able to kill one of them, or maybe, a staggered line of them, because when you do kill one, it does do an 8-yard AoE around it that heals all the other Void Wardens and reduces the damage they take by 99%. So likely you'd be killing one, if I had to guess, or maybe a couple separated, or maybe you don't even kill these at all. Maybe the whole idea is you just avoid them, or how many wars are we going to say? Or maybe these are tankable, and the whole idea is that you have one tank pull a Void Warden out, or you death grip a Void Warden out just before it dies, and you kill it away from the group so it doesn't trigger this on the rest of the Void Warden. Again, not 100% sure how this is going to function. I just listed like 3 or 4 different ways it could function, and you can handle them in varying ways depending on how that actually works. All I know for sure is this is probably going to be super annoying for melee, because they just knock back players who get too close to it. Maybe this zone is super small and you can get into melee and hit them, but otherwise, let's go ranged. Ranged favored patch. Who could have predicted this? Wow. And we talked about the other ad, we talked about the tank debuff, and I believe that is actually it for this phase. So again, potentially this is separated by another intermission where you go from like Artosian's platform to Pargas' platform. Not 100% sure. Either way, once you've defeated both, you go into phase 3. Xalatath does some counterattack on Dimensius, and you get 15 seconds of a 100% damage amp on the boss, so that's probably going to be a nice lust location to take advantage of that damage amp at the start of P3 when nothing is happening, because the boss also stunned for those 15 seconds. And this is the boss platform. So again, cool looking platform. Not sure the scale, could still be massive. My understanding is that it's smaller than this one. I believe that the boss like shrinks or something over the between phase 1 and phase 3. He gets smaller. So he's going to be in the middle of this platform here, almost certainly. And the whole idea with this phase is that he's got this accretion disc, which is this like swirling thing on the edge of the platform. And throughout this phase, he's going to continue to cast Devour. And then when that happens, the disc shrinks in. So you're going to be losing space and losing space and losing space every Devour cast until you have nothing left, essentially. And so that's going to be basically the timer on this fight, or phase rather. So both P1 and P2 and P3 all have timers built into the phase where you can just lose to essentially an enrage. So something to keep in mind early on a patch is which phase are we actually the most scared of, or the tightest in terms of a damage check? Is it phase 1? It could be. It is possible that you're closest to running into a situation where you have not enough smashes to give you enough of the gravity field, not gravity fields, rather the actual collective gravity for the Devours in phase 1. And so maybe we need a lust on pull in order to survive that. Maybe this DPS check is pretty free, and maybe you have to like split your group here, and this DPS check is tight, and you have to beat the 32-second timer or whatever it is. But maybe both those are free, and you just lust on the damage amp. But I guess to be clear, it's not actually guaranteed you lust on the damage amp, right? It seems to make the most sense just because of, you know, this is also a DPS check, and I kind of assume the tight DPS check is going to be P3, but especially on normal and heroic early on in the season, it may not actually be the tight DPS check. This might be the easiest DPS check because of the damage amp, and so because there's also DPS checks in each of the previous phases, you may want to lust in them instead because they're harder to meet. So just something to keep in mind, especially early on. But obviously, when in my full guide, I will let you guys know when we end up choosing to lust in our lower gear to start the season. Now you have some repeat mechanics. Of course, Oblivion, boss still there. If you get touched, you instantly die. Cosmic Radiation, passive damage, and this is also what kind of goes up with the Devour in this phase. So instead of you needing more collective gravity, you just take more and more raid damage every time Devour is cast. It, like I said, also pulls in the accretion disc when this happens, and it also pulls in these void stars and black holes that spawn in this phase, which we'll cover in a second here, because obviously there is no collective gravity in this phase. So how do we actually live? And by living it, you need to be in a gravity well. So what is a gravity well? It comes from Extinguish the Stars. This spawns 8 void stars around the room. You need to avoid the 5-yard circles that they create, and each one also deals a hit of raid damage. So it's going to be over 10 seconds, I believe. So it's essentially kind of this channeled damage over 10 seconds, 8 hits overall. And then once they've all landed, they will all create a gravity well around them and then begin to orbit the boss. So these gravity wells are these like moving things orbiting the boss around these void stars. So again, probably going to look pretty sick. I kind of expect it to look maybe a little similar to the Nexus King P3 stuff if people have seen that. So sounds sick as hell. They're going to slow you, of course, but unlike the collective gravity fields, which did nothing besides slow you, this is also going to tick for some shadow damage in that area as well. They're also smaller, only 4 yards. And the other thing to keep in mind, again, because this is rotating around, or it's around the void stars, and the void stars get pulled in by Devour, you're going to need to move with this gravity well as well. So I'm not sure if it pulls you in at the same rate. Obviously, you're going to be a little slowed, so you may need to keep up with it. Who knows? But these are going to move during the actual the Devour pull in. So keep that in mind, because again, in this phase as well, it also pulls players in during the dot portion of it. It's not just a static. You only get pulled in if you're not safe. At the end of it, you get pulled in the whole time. These void stars get pulled in the whole time. The accretion disc gets pulled in the whole time. And then also these black holes get pulled in. So black hole is going to occasionally mark a void star. It's going to blow up after 5 seconds, dealing fall off damage. So you need to run away from the void star that's blowing up. And then it turns into a black hole, which continues to orbit Dimensius. And so you now need to stay away from that black hole during the rest of the fight as it's orbiting the boss. And this is the same as the black hole in the Intermission, where it just instantly murders you if you touch it. So some raid damage and something to avoid for the remainder of the fight. Speaking of avoiding, let's talk about the tanks because the boss still has his 15-yard splash damage knockback ability in this phase. And he also still does an AoE tank hit. This one's only 12 yards instead of 20, so it's actually smaller than the fist that you're already doing. And it applies a cosmic damage taken increase instead of a physical damage taken increase. So you don't necessarily need to taunt off immediately, though you'll probably want to taunt off relatively quickly. But the big thing here is, again, on heroic specifically, not on normal, it will pull all players 20 yards towards the impact location, up to 20 yards. If you're closer than that, you'll less. But this is interesting, right? Because obviously you can be pulled through the boss. That's bad. You die. You can get pulled through a black hole. That's bad. You die. You can get pulled into the active tank who just got hit by this debuff, and then get triggered this Fist of the Void Lord and get knocked back 15 yards again, which is another hit of shadow damage. That's survivable, but do you really want to do it? Unlikely. So you're going to probably want to be playing nearly 40 yards away from the active tank to make sure that you don't trigger this, or maybe you need to have a taunt swap immediately to another tank who is disadvancing or leaping or something and staying away from the other tank and is also away from the rest of the raid, and then they immediately take the melee hit after that and everything's safe. Hard to tell. Again, you don't necessarily need to swap, so maybe you could position in such a way that the active tank will take the melee after, and then you swap afterwards, or maybe you swap mid this happening and the boss will do his first melee on a different tank, and then they can be away from the rest of the raid and you don't need to worry about this. But that's something you need to think about, is how to not cleave your raid. Some people maybe suggested you could just cleave your raid and knock them back to their original position. That's another 3 million shadow damage. I'm not sure you want to do that. I guess it's not the end of the world, but what you're now also worried about is how does this ability happen in terms of the timing with other abilities, right? Because we talked about like the Extinguish the Stars and the Devour. Right? What if it happens just before Devour? You can't pull people away from their gravity wells, right? Because they need to make sure that they're in one. Right. The other ability you need to be aware of is Darkened Sky here, which does a bunch of 12-yard AoEs, unsure on the exact number, by the way, which are lethal. So again, another lethal circle you need to avoid. But then these shoot out these like Shadow Quake shockwaves is what it seems like. So they are like these rings that shoot outward from the impact location, which put a 3-second debuff on you. And on heroic it's the 300%. So gets out of hand very quickly. On normal it's only 100%, so you can kind of stack it up a little bit without really getting punished. But what it seems like, because this is only a 3-second debuff duration, is that when you get hit by a shockwave, you want to make sure you are running away from the next shockwave so that this debuff falls off and you take the regular damage hit instead of the 300% or even the 100% for normal amped damage hit. And then, you know, maybe this Tank Buster, the pull-in, can pull you over these Shadowquake shockwaves. Maybe it pulls you through them and it instantly kills you, right? So maybe you need to make sure you position so you pull people away from the Shadowquake shockwaves, right? So the overlap of this tank hit with the other abilities is important and will probably impact how you handle it. Staying on top of these shockwaves as well, maybe you can probably blink them. I think most shockwave type abilities you can blink. If you remember the last boss in Aurora Palace, Queen Ansarek, you could also leap over some of them, or like transcend or whatever like that port too, right? So there is potentially a lot of ways to get over this, but we're not sure exactly what's going to work. Ports are probably going to work, like transcend, warlock port, that kind of thing. Is a warlock gate going to work? Unsure. Is blink going to work? Probably. Are leaps going to work? Maybe. Who actually knows? We'll have to wait and see, but this is something you're going to have to be able to handle as well, and make sure you don't take 2 ticks of these shadow quakes within 3 seconds, otherwise you're likely going to be dead. Outside of this, the only other thing that happens in this phase, I know, is this Void Grasp dot. This is going to go out on a bunch of random players, essentially replacing the gravity stuff from P1. And this is going to be a dot and slow. So this is a 50% slow in heroic. I believe it's smaller on normal. It's only 30% only. Still a pretty decent slow. So it's going to make doing all these mechanics much more annoying, right? Imagine trying to dodge the quakes here while you're slowed by 50%. It's going to be challenging. So you're going to be potentially wanting freedom effects ready, you know, snare breaks if you have them, just movement speed increases, etc., to help people deal with all these mechanics, but also help deal with these slow dots as well. And that just about wraps up the final boss of the War Within. So I am curious, what do you guys think of this boss? Does it sound cool, interesting, boring? How do you think some of these mechanics should be handled? Let me know down in the comments below, and make sure you do subscribe for my normal, heroic, and mythic raid guides coming from Manaforge Omega, and of course beyond into Midnight. Of course, I got to shout out all of my Patreons for their continued support. Could not do this without you guys, so thank you, and I'll see everyone in the next video.